Well, it is extraordinary how much they seem to have been captured by the boss's desire to please Putin. And of course, if the boss, Mr. Trump, is all-powerful, as he is at the moment, what he says goes, and they take their lead from his tone and his wishes and his ideas. And you sort of wonder whether people like Marco Rubio, who's a fairly wise statesman, I mean, the man has experience and is somebody who has authority in foreign affairs, whether he really goes along with all this or whether he knows where it might be leading, because the Allies have been telling the Americans, both straight out and also through diplomatic channels, what on earth are you doing? You're simply giving the whole thing to Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by former Moscow correspondent, diplomatic editor and long-standing leader writer for The Times, Michael Binion. Michael, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to start with today Trump's expansion of the Ukraine minerals deal that he's called for. He's demanding Ukraine hand over pretty much all of the minerals and resources that they have to repay the US for its assistance in the war in Ukraine, before it's then allowed to access a sort of joint fund alongside the US. I mean, can you see any reason why Ukraine would sign that agreement?
None at all. It looks like pure plunder. I mean, it seems absolutely outrageous to demand that Ukraine hand over all its future earnings, which will be desperately needed if and when there is ever peace, to rebuild the country, and in fact is one of the key exports that Ukraine would be counting on to maintain their own economy and to defend their own independence in the future. So I think they have sort of reluctantly agreed that there would be American participation in the exploitation of these minerals, but to hand over the whole lot and virtually the entire future earnings to a joint company, which of course, or would in theory split the earnings between the US and Ukraine, but probably in practice most of it would go to America. Well, to do that would be, I think, madness.
Is there any way this could work, though? I mean, the US are putting this forward as the idea of a sort of long-term US investment in the country. Could that benefit Ukraine at all? I mean, if there is separate security guarantees provided by Europe or something like that?
Well, it could benefit Ukraine in that a lot of technology and machinery and processing and things of that kind will be needed to extract these minerals, process them, export them, and do what they can to get the value from them. And you do need a lot of capital, and America has capital, and you do need the participation of people who have the technical know-how. And in that sense, American participation would be very useful. But to hand over the whole thing in advance, as it were, even to a joint company, it seems to me rather rash. And it's rather suggesting that America gets the benefit now without providing any quid pro quo, namely security. The argument could be that, of course, if the Americans are there on the ground for the future, I mean, in a long-term basis, they would be there to act as a tripwire to stop any kind of invasion if it came from the Russians. But I think that's more theoretical if there's no actual proposal for a security guarantee now, which is what the Ukrainians want above all else.
There we are. And how do you think Russia is going to be judging all of this disagreement over a possible minerals deal?
Well, with some satisfaction, I would think, particularly if the United States doesn't seem inclined to offer the security guarantees that Ukraine has asked for. The Russians also know that squabbling over mineral rights is something that will further alienate Ukraine from the Americans. And at the same time, it looks as though the Americans seem to be of the mind that dividing up the spoils of Ukraine is a legitimate thing to do. And therefore, the Russians would sort of say, well, of course, we can help, extract minerals from the territory where we are, or from, we can be partners in this. I mean, the whole thing is also helping Putin to basically prevaricate in all the negotiations going on over Ukraine's future. And it's yet another way of stalling any prospect of an immediate ceasefire.
And while a lot of this conversation goes on about the future of Ukraine and its relationship with America. The US has been seemingly very hesitant to put any pressure on Russia yet in these negotiations. In fact, it largely seems to have accepted the Russian position on Ukraine. Is it possible that this approach is actually pushing Putin to go back on the offensive and try and get more from Ukraine in these talks?
Well, almost certainly, yes. If he's not feeling the pressure from America, and if he's not feeling that this ceasefire is really going to make a big difference or going to force him to make concessions that he doesn't want to make, then there's no real incentive to do anything about it. I mean, he of course will pay lip service to it, and he'll try to string the Americans along as far as possible and for as long as possible. But I don't think that this will have any real effect on Ukraine's security. I mean, it's still being attacked every day. It might push Mr. Trump to think, well, the Russians are not playing ball. They'll be quite careful to say, oh, yes, we're on side. We're going to do it. Yes, we're doing it. But what they do is they set more and more conditions that become more and more difficult to fulfill. In particular, the condition, first of all, that there's got to be new elections in Ukraine, that they want Zelensky out. Well, I don't think the Americans have much love for Zelensky, so they might go along with that. But of course, this would just take longer, play for time. Meanwhile, the battlefront will be continuing. The one thing they might be in danger of doing is overplaying their hand with attacks. They've not agreed to stop attacks on infrastructure completely. Ukraine has pointed to a number of Russian attacks in recent days, after they'd said they'd stopped doing it, on energy supplies and on the key vital infrastructure. And at the same time, the Russians are pushing for a Black Sea deal, which is going to be clearly in Russia's advantage. The Black Sea is one of the few areas where Ukraine still seems to have the upper hand, and the Russians have been on the defensive there. In fact, so much so that they've had to move a number of their ships from Sebastopol, where they were in range of Ukrainian attacks and missiles, move them across to the far shore of the Black Sea, further away. And so a Black Sea deal would clearly be in Russia's advantage. The Ukrainians have also been told that this deal will not happen unless, or they've more or less said it must go ahead now. The Russians have said the Black Sea attacks will not cease unless Ukraine plays ball. And so we have to think, well, are they going to come to a deal on this or not?
A lot of the Black Sea deal or ceasefire that the Russians are pushing for now seems to be in line with the grain deal that was already in place. The Russians seem quite keen to get their exports restarted through the Black Sea, but is that really going to help the state of the Russian economy at this point?
Well, it could, yes. I mean, it is important that Russia has a way of reaching the outside world by the Black Sea and through the Mediterranean. It's very expensive to try to send everything round the North Cape, out from Murmansk or through St. Petersburg that way. And so they do need to get things going out. They do need the Black Sea to be open. But the Ukrainians are not really in much of a position to stop the Russians. Equally, the Russians haven't tried to stop the export of Ukrainian grain since the deal that was brokered by Turkey, almost 2 years ago, I think, some time ago. So at the moment, there's not much that the Ukrainians can do to stop the Russians, and there's not much the Ukrainians need from the Russians from such a deal. So there's not much incentive for Ukraine to do anything about it, and there's every incentive for the Russians to push it a bit because they are actually not winning in that area.
And you mentioned the idea of elections in Ukraine just then. The latest on that is that earlier today, Putin floated this idea of a UN-led authority taking over governance of Ukraine in order to set up elections. That's a slightly significant change in tone from the Kremlin, allowing outsiders in to deal with this. Is there anything workable in that, or is this just another attempt to delegitimize Zelensky's government?
Well, don't forget that Russia is a member of the Security Council of the UN, and so anything agreed by the UN would presumably only be agreed along lines of what the Security Council would approve. And Russia there has a veto, and also it is one of the 5 influential voices on the Security Council. So this is quite different from suggesting that NATO could be peacekeepers, where Russia has no influence at all. But if you get the UN involved, it could be, pushed and swung either way. And also, I think the Russians know that the UN might not be a very credible or even effective force. We don't quite know how UN forces have managed to keep peace in other areas, and sometimes they have certainly failed. One thinks of the peacekeeping force, for example, in Lebanon, the United Nations, which frankly did nothing to keep the peace at all, and particularly when the Israelis attacked, it was in no position to do anything. And so I think the Russians feel it would be merely just a sort of token force. But it's a way of stalling any negotiations on an actual ceasefire. And it's also a way of suggesting that Zelensky is an illegitimate ruler. There needs to be elections, and pending that, the UN would patrol whatever it is. What, of course, Russia would like to see is elections in which the Russians, have a chance of using proxies or whoever to push their own candidate and push somebody who might be more accommodating. In other words, set up a sort of patsy in government, have somebody in Kiev who they think would be more amenable to what Russia would like. And that, I think, is the long-term strategy, whatever the outcome of the so-called peace negotiations going on at the moment. The strategy is to have a pliant government in Kiev, and getting rid of Zelensky would be the very first step in such a process.
And I think maybe reflective of Putin's angle on this, part of his proposal was this idea that North Korea, BRICS nations, should be brought into the talks. What does that say, though, interestingly, about Russia's relationship with its allies in this conflict?
Well, I wonder whether the BRICS nations really would want to be included in this. I mean, there's no gain for them at all. The North Koreans, well, they are included anyway because they've sent people, they've sent soldiers to the front, and they're having a rather tough time. I mean, they're not really used to fighting an active war, and quite a lot have been killed. We don't really know the fate of the North Koreans. Quite a few have been captured and killed, and of course they don't have much say in how they are deployed or what contribution they're expected to make. So I think North Korea certainly would be willing to be part of any kind of discussion on the future of what's going on in Ukraine. The other BRICS nations, I mean, places like Brazil, what's in it for them? I mean, they don't. It's far away for them. They're not interested. China, of course, is a BRICS nation, and that has pretty close relations with Russia in any case. There are consultations going on all the time between the Russians and the Chinese, with the Chinese essentially cracking the whip. I mean, they are the ones that can call the shots there. So I don't think they need to be formally brought in. They're there already, as it were. And then South Africa, well, again, that's far away. They have other things to do, and I'm not sure that they would be interested in being associated with anything in Ukraine. They are in poor relations with the West at the moment, particularly with the Americans. And I think it would cause some problems for them if they were sort of seen by the Americans as being on Russia's side.
Well, on the other side of this, among Ukraine's allies, although it's sounding less and less like they really are, Zelensky has said that Trump's acting Russia envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been parroting the Russian line in that interview last weekend with Tucker Carlson. How much should we be worried about Trump insiders falling into this sort of almost typical Russian disinformation campaign?
Well, it is extraordinary how much they seem to have been captured by the boss's desire to please Putin. And of course, if the boss, Mr. Trump, is all-powerful, as he is at the moment, what he says goes, and they take their lead from his tone and his wishes and his ideas. And you sort of wonder whether people like Marco Rubio, who's a fairly wise statesman, I mean, the man has experience and is somebody who has authority in foreign affairs, whether he really goes along with all this or whether he knows where it might be leading, because the Allies have been telling the Americans, both straight out and also through diplomatic channels, what on earth are you doing? You're simply giving the whole thing to Russia. You're just giving Putin one concession after another. And it's not really clear to what extent Mr. Trump is either aware of that or worried about it or cares about it. It seems that he doesn't really care. He thinks the big thing is to do a deal personally with Putin. He feels he has this personal relationship with Putin, and he says, I trust him, he's going to deliver. And of course, that's why the Russians keep saying, yes, of course, we're with you. We're there to do a peace deal, while all the time shuffling in the opposite direction. But they will say yes, because they know that that's what Trump wants to hear. And it certainly is true that it's extraordinary how naive some of the people around Donald Trump, and particularly those associated with these Ukraine negotiations, how naive they appear to be, how sort of blind. I mean, you would have thought that anybody could see that tactics are delaying tactics, and that there doesn't seem to be anything concrete to show for all this.
Well, we were talking there about, Europe telling America what it could do to maybe usher these negotiations along. I mean, one point that's been made is, could any of this work unless Trump or the US set a deadline for the Russians, as recommended by the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer?
I don't think so, really. Until we actually have a peace deal to patrol, to guarantee, nothing can be done. And of course, both the Russians and the Americans have in some way excluded Europe. The Russians have said they don't want any NATO forces on their soil. The Americans have made it clear they won't provide backup for air power backup, and that any force from Europe, even led by Britain and France, is there on its own. Well, it wouldn't be very effective. I mean, it could only be a sort of tripwire warning at best. It wouldn't be able, without proper air defense, it wouldn't be able to stand up to a sustained Russian attack. If that came, I'm not sure that it would necessarily mean that Russia would straight away try to attack the rest of Ukraine. I think they need a strategic pause themselves in any case. But the idea of trying to guarantee a peace without much American backing is difficult. And it looks as though the Americans don't have much time for the Europeans in any case, either as a fighting force or as allies. And we saw this revealed in the most startling sort of language, where we get, the leaked conversation about Yemen, where we get senior US officials talking about the Europeans being pathetic and expressing basically contempt and disdain for their European allies, which isn't the best basis on which to form some kind of Western peacekeeping guarantee.
Well, one of Trump's staunchest critics, J.D. Vance, seems to have left such a good impression on the Europeans that Trump has sent him almost all the way to the Arctic today. He's in Greenland, seemingly working on Trump's plan to take over this area from Denmark. What do we make of that? I mean, has Trump made any progress on convincing the Greenlanders that they should become Americans?
Oh, none at all, no. I mean, the Greenlanders have been frankly bemused and absolutely unsure what to do about that. Their so-called protector, namely Denmark, which has rule over, well, potentially responsibility for Greenland's foreign policy and its security. I mean, the Danes too, it's a small country. They can't very well say to the Americans, we defy you, because the Americans could just flip them away and say, well, I don't really mind what you think. That does show America, of course, in an extremely awkward moral light. I mean, one would say, what's the difference between saying, I want to annex this country, and Putin saying, I want to annex Ukraine? And very little moral difference at all. I mean, it might be that they wouldn't use the force in that sense. It might be that they would offer Greenland a very lucrative financial deal. It might be that they would say, yes, you can have a better standard of living, and you won't be under the colonial control of Denmark, which a lot of Greenlanders, in fact, would like. They don't really want to feel that they're still tied to Danish rule and Danish involvement, particularly as the Danes haven't been particularly generous in funding Greenland's infrastructure or its defense. They've pepped up all of a sudden, realizing their rule may come to a sudden end. But it is a most extraordinary situation. Now, Vance's visit has been played around with several times. It started off that his wife was going to make a kind of cultural visit to go and look at dog sled racing. Yes, well, I'm not sure what the great interest in that is in the Vance household, but she professed this huge interest. And then that was thought to be rather political and rather, inappropriate. So they wanted to up it a bit and send Vance. And then the Greenlanders made it clear they didn't really want him coming along to some kind of event in Greenland itself. So he then switched it so that it was only Vance going, and only to the American base, where he has a more legitimate reason to go and look at what the Americans have got up there and what they're doing. But what is the point of the visit apart from political intimidation? You begin to wonder.
And what does all of that, I mean, this slightly strange insistence on taking over Greenland, the European Union and Ukraine's European allies being left out of the talks, what does all of that say about the US relationship with Europe and with NATO?
It's a pretty poor relationship at the moment, and it's one getting worse by the day because of some fairly unguarded and frankly regrettable statements coming out of Washington. Now, the Americans haven't actually taken hostile action in any way against NATO. They are raising all sorts of questions which call into doubt Americans' commitment. I mean, they're raising questions about whether there should be an American commander-in-chief, SACEUR, as they call it, the commander-in-chief of the military force of NATO in Europe. And that traditionally has always been an American, in the sense that that has felt that ties American security to European security. And that's the sort of bedrock of what the North Atlantic Alliance has always been about. Now, if the Americans are saying, well, we're not sure we need to take this job, and people are putting forward maybe the British Chief of the Defence Staff as a possible successor, Britain's hurriedly saying, no, we're not looking for that job at all. It does raise questions of what is the American commitment to NATO? I mean, they have done several things which, frankly, are perfectly reasonable, such as saying, look, Europeans, you need to pay more for your own defence. You're getting a free ride, or not, you're getting a pretty cheap ride at the moment from our nuclear umbrella and our ultimate defence of Europe. And you need to cough up a bit more, which they are beginning to do. But now I think a lot of Europeans are extremely worried that this is only the start of creeping pressure, and that America, frankly, has other fish to fry. They're looking to the Pacific, they're looking to China, which is where they see a greater challenge to American global power. And they want to sort of sort out their own immediate security, hence the frankly ridiculous suggestion that Canada should become a 51st state, Greenland should be annexed. But that would give America a huge strategic belt of territory between Russia, Europe, and America, or indeed any Chinese sort of advance from the north. Not that's likely to happen right now, but it's all part of a sort of, I would call, rather simplistic strategic thinking in Washington, which doesn't seem to be thought through at all. And it seems to be made up on the hoof.
Well, the Kremlin no doubt will be viewing this current split between Europe and America with some pleasure. But is a US-Europe split on Ukraine really good for Putin? Or should this now quite bolstered Europe and NATO, or European NATO, be worrying for him?
Well, I think the bolstering of European NATO happened before the split with America. It happened when places such as Finland and Sweden decided, after years of neutrality, that Russia was just being too aggressive on their own doorstep and they would join NATO. And it happened when NATO itself, right at the start of this whole crisis, straight after the invasion of Ukraine, pulled together and said, we must work together, we must act together. It helped Britain to get back into Europe, not as a European Union member, but as a key member of NATO, cementing its ties with its former EU allies and now its present NATO partners. So the bolstering has already happened. But of course, the European worry that they're going to be on their own has been hugely increased, much to the satisfaction of the Kremlin, because one thing they would like to see is a weakening of this solid front against them. And if America can be peeled off, well, then they really feel this is much less of a threat. They've always seen NATO as a threat, and to some extent, looked at from Moscow, you can see why. Because NATO was set up to stop the advance of Soviet interests into Eastern Europe, to halt the spread of communism westwards. And the fact is that when NATO was enlarged, Western powers in NATO said, oh, it's in order to have a pan-European security structure. But the new members of NATO who joined said, no, 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 that's not what it's about. It's to protect us from Russia, which is the old reason for joining NATO. And places like Poland have long made it clear that they see NATO basically as a shield against Russia. And of course, Russia then says, well, NATO is therefore a spearhead against us. And they have always felt that NATO is a strategic threat and a challenge. And this is what lies behind the whole Ukraine thing right from the start. They saw the EU as a stepping stone to NATO for Ukraine, the wish for Ukraine to get closer to the EU. But the spectre of Ukraine joining NATO is absolutely unacceptable. And I think the Americans also have realized that. And most Europeans, whatever they say, think that, frankly, Ukraine joining NATO is utterly unrealistic.
And how likely is this sanctions relief on SWIFT banking that Russia is now petitioning for? Europe has said, no, we're not going to go along with this, but the Americans haven't been as staunch. Is there a scenario where America could force Europe to let Russian banks back into SWIFT, do you think?
I think that's very difficult. I think it's very much in Putin's interest to get relief from sanctions. This is basically the basic reason he's agreed, really, to go along with any kind of negotiations over Ukraine, in the hope that the Americans will drop some of the sanctions, which, whatever they say in Russia, are hurting. The economy so far has done okay, but inflation is very high. There's no investment going into anything other than the military. There's a lot of worry about, pay now, or rather, get things now, pay later. And they're very much in hock to the Chinese for strategic materials as well as export markets. So the economy really is suffering, and they do need to be able to trade, particularly openly, in oil and other huge things that make a difference to the Russian economy. So they want relief from sanctions. Now, the Americans might give them some relief, but it's very peculiar. The Americans can't really force the Europeans to lift their sanctions. They can't insist that Switzerland accepts dealings with Russian banks. It's pretty unclear. Western sanctions are nearly always unanimous sanctions. There are individual sanctions on individual people that some countries put down. America, for example, has had sanctions on individual Russians long before Europeans did. But that's not the same as blanket economic sanctions. And I'm not sure really whether America is in any position to dictate to Europe about that. Clearly, though, that is one of the things that Putin wants most of all from any deal with Trump.
And I just wanted to finish with a couple of questions on this French and British-led reassurance force that we've heard more about this week. The US increasingly appears opposed to the idea, despite the fact that they originally came up with the idea of a peacekeeping force. Can they stop the ball rolling on this at this point?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, Britain, which would be one of the key members of this force, is very anxious to play down differences with America. I mean, Britain feels very strongly that it can only harm relations in general if the quarrel gets worse. And Britain also feels that America is so closely bound with Britain in particular on defense and especially on security, intelligence service, intelligence sharing, that they don't want to do anything that would jeopardize that. And if the Americans are very, upset or wary of any European initiative, Britain will not push it too hard. I mean, I think the French are much more ready to, give the Trump administration a bit of a biff on the nose if they can. But the French, they're on their own. The Germans will be wary. There's a new government there. They're not sure exactly what their strategic stance is going to be or what their capabilities are. I think all of Europe is much more worried at the moment, right now, about a trade war, which would be probably, in the short term, much more disastrous than any disagreement about long-term security. And so they're all thinking about that. And Britain is trying to play a sort of, I won't say mediating role, but a sort of calming role. It's not clear that that's actually having much effect.
But how will this play for the Kremlin if the outcome of any ceasefire or peace talks are NATO member troops in Ukraine?
Well, Putin's more or less said he's not having that. Now, they could have those troops there under a different hat. They could be called United Nations troops, for example, which is a thing he's suggested. He's thinking of sort of, pliant countries like perhaps Brazil or somewhere in Asia, Thailand or somewhere where they feel that this would not be in any way giving an advantage to NATO. No, I think actually stationing troops there it's going to be very difficult to get the Russians to agree to it. And in any case, they would only be sort of tripwire troops. They're there to say, well, actually the Russians have invaded, so we now need to, reconsolidate and get ready for a full-scale fight. They're not much in a position to take on the full Russian army, whatever the scenario. And I don't think it's a very realistic prospect. Equally, I don't think that Putin will immediately invade if there is a peace deal. I mean, the idea is that Putin needs to be stopped because otherwise he'll just regroup and consolidate and get straight into Ukraine. I don't really think that would be wise. I mean, it may not be wise, but I don't think it'd be in Putin's interest. They do need to regroup and consolidate their own forces. They've lost a lot of people, a lot of material. It's costing them a lot of money. Much better, from Putin's point of view, is to engineer elections so that they get a government in Ukraine which is pliant and which can be manipulated and controlled. And they don't need a full-scale military invasion again. And even if they did occupy Ukraine, most of its territory, it would be a nightmare. They would have partisan warfare against them forevermore at a huge cost. And I don't think that's what they have in mind.
Well, Michael Binion, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.